Whispers in the dark. Truth dies with silence. The rain fell in relentless sheets, drumming against the cracked windows of Holloway House. The old mansion stood on the edge of town, forgotten by time, wrapped in ivy and silence. Detective Harris had been called here before, but never under such troubling circumstances. A young woman had vanished 3 nights ago. Her name was Emily Wren, a local schoolteacher beloved by nearly everyone in the village. She had been last seen leaving the library, her umbrella snapping in the storm. And then, nothing. No trace, no sound, only an eerie absence that grew heavier with each passing day. Now the villagers whispered about Holloway House. Some swore they heard voices in the night. Others claimed lights flickered in its upper windows, though no one lived there. Detective Harris didn't believe in ghost stories, but he did believe in patterns, and this house had a dark history of them. The air was damp and cold as he stepped inside. The heavy front door groaned like a warning. His torch beam cut across faded wallpaper, stained with water and shadow, the smell of mildew mixed with something metallic. He paused. Blood. Not fresh, but unmistakable. It trailed faintly across the floorboards, leading deeper into the hall. Harris crouched, his gloved fingers brushing the dried streak. The silence pressed in closer, as though the house itself was holding its breath. A gust of wind rattled the broken chandelier above him. His instinct screamed that someone had been here recently, perhaps still was. He advanced cautiously, each step measured, his senses heightened. The corridor stretched long and narrow, swallowing the light. Every shadow seemed to move just beyond the reach of his torch. He reached the library, its door half open. Inside, books lay scattered across the floor as if torn from the shelves in a hurry. The window was cracked ajar, rain seeping in through the gap. Harris noted muddy footprints near the sill. Small, light, too small for a man. Emily's? He followed the prints back across the room. They stopped abruptly at the fireplace. He frowned. No one simply vanished into stone, but something caught his eye, an uneven seam in the brickwork. He pressed it. The wall shifted with a hollow click. A hidden passage yawned open in the darkness. The air that rushed out was colder still, tinged with decay. Harris steadied his breath and entered. The passage sloped downward, narrow and suffocating. Each step echoed, as though countless footsteps had traveled here before. His torchlight revealed claw marks along the walls. Deep, desperate scratches gouged into the stone. Someone had tried to escape. His pulse quickened. At the end of the passage, a wooden door loomed. He tried the handle, locked. From the other side came the faintest sound. A whisper. He pressed his ear closer. It was soft, ragged, almost like breath. Then words formed, broken and trembling. "Help! Me!" Harris's heart lurched. "Emily!" He forced the door, shoulder slamming into the rotted wood. It cracked open, splinters flying. The beam of his torch cut into the darkness beyond. A small, dimly lit chamber appeared, walls lined with chains. In the center, a chair sat bolted to the floor. A length of rope lay discarded beside it. But the room was empty. No Emily, no captive. Only the lingering echo of the whisper. Harris turned slowly, torch sweeping across the chamber. Shadows crawled along the stone walls, shifting unnaturally. Then he saw it. Another message scratched into the wall with jagged nails. Truth dies with silence. His blood ran cold. This was no ordinary disappearance. This was deliberate. Someone was playing a cruel game, and he had just stepped into the center of it. He raised his torch again, scanning the chamber. The whisper returned, this time closer, louder, right behind him. He spun around. Nothing but darkness, and then the door slammed shut. The sound reverberated through the chamber like a final warning. Harris was trapped. But worse than that, he was not alone. Somewhere in the suffocating dark, unseen eyes were watching, and the whispers were only just beginning. The old house creaked as if it remembered every step I took, its bones groaning under the weight of hidden memories. I had grown up inside these walls, yet tonight they felt unfamiliar, almost hostile. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of dust and aged wood, as though the house itself was trying to suffocate me with its silence. I paused at the base of the staircase, staring upward where shadows pooled, clinging to the corners as if they had secrets to hide. Somewhere deep in my chest, a knot tightened. This wasn't just fear, it was recognition. My fingers brushed the railing, cold beneath my touch, and I started up the stairs. Each step sounded louder than it should have, echoing like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I had been told to stay out of the attic, told it was just a storage space filled with boxes and broken furniture. But lies always leave traces, and tonight I was ready to follow them. The lantern in my hand flickered, shadows dancing across the walls. At the top of the stairs, the attic door loomed like a gatekeeper. Its paint was chipped, its wood scarred, as if someone had tried to keep it closed against something that wanted out. The key ID stolen from my Uncle S' desk felt too small for the weight it carried. When the lock turned, the sound was deafening, a sharp click that made me flinch. I pushed the door open, and the smell of dust and decay hit me instantly. The air inside was colder, as though the attic existed outside of time. My lantern's glow swept across forgotten trunks, stacked boxes, and shrouded shapes that looked disturbingly human until I moved closer. And then I saw it. The trunk in the corner, darker than the rest, its surface etched with strange markings I didn't recognize. Kneeling, I traced the carvings with my hand. They weren't decorative. They were deliberate. Symbols, sharp and purposeful, carved into the wood as if sealing something inside. My pulse quickened. With a deep breath, I unlatched the trunk. The hinges screamed in protest, and inside lay a stack of papers bound in string, yellowed with age. Beneath them was a small leather-bound book, the kind you'd expect to hold prayers or poetry. But when I opened it, my breath caught. The handwriting was my mother's. She had been gone for years, taken by an accident no one spoke about. Yet here, in my hands, was her voice. The first page was dated 3 months before her death, and the words scrawled across it bled with urgency. She wrote of whispers at night, of someone watching from the shadows, of a pact she had been forced into. The entries grew darker as I flipped through them. Pages of fear, of warnings, of names I recognized. Family members, neighbors, even the priest who had buried her. Every line was another thread, weaving a web around my family I hadn't known existed. I read until my hands shook, the lantern guttering beside me. Then a sound broke through, the creak of a floorboard not my own. I froze. The attic was supposed to be empty. Slowly, I turned toward the far end of the room. For a moment, I thought the shadows had shifted, but then I saw it. A figure, half hidden, standing perfectly still. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. My throat was dry, my chest tight. The figure didn't move. It only watched. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the lantern's flame died, plunging me into darkness. My scream never left my lips. Only silence. The night after I found my mother's journal, sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, the words replayed in my mind, heavy with meaning I didn't yet understand. Whispers. A pact. Shadows, watching from corners of the house. I tried to convince myself it was grief talking, the ramblings of a woman unraveled by her own fears. But deep down, I knew better. My mother had been careful, deliberate. She wouldn't have written those words without reason. By dawn, I found myself wandering the house, restless. The hallways seemed narrower, as though the walls leaned closer with each step I took. Sunlight crept through the tall windows, but even in daylight, the house carried an unease that pressed against my skin. Every creak of the wooden floor, every sigh of the old beams, sounded like something alive. My uncle sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee. His eyes flicked to me, sharp and searching, before settling back on the newspaper spread before him. "You look tired," he said, his voice calm but strangely flat, like he was rehearsing concern rather than feeling it. "I couldn't sleep," I admitted. My voice cracked slightly, betraying the weight in my chest. He folded the newspaper neatly and placed it on the table. "This house does that to people. It has character." His gaze lingered on me too long, and something in my stomach twisted. I wanted to ask him about the attic, about my mother's journal, about the names she had written. But the way his eyes pinned me in place made me bite my tongue. Instead, I said, "Did my mother keep any old diaries?" His hand froze halfway to his cup. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe fear, but it vanished just as quickly. He shook his head. "Not that I know of." The lie was so thin it almost snapped between us. That afternoon, I returned to the attic. The journal burned in my mind, each page urging me deeper into a labyrinth I wasn't sure I could escape. I needed answers, and I knew they weren't going to come from polite questions at the breakfast table. As I searched the room again, I noticed something I had overlooked before. A trapdoor in the floorboards, nearly invisible beneath layers of dust. My heart quickened. With effort, I pried it open. A musty draft rose up, carrying the stench of damp stone and rot. A narrow stairwell descended into darkness. Lantern in hand, I forced myself down, one step at a time. The air grew colder, the silence heavier, until I reached the bottom. The space beneath the attic wasn't just storage. It was a hidden chamber, carved into the very foundation of the house. The walls were lined with shelves filled with boxes, jars, and objects I couldn't name. But what drew my attention was the table at the center. Upon it lay scraps of parchment, each covered in the same strange symbols carved into the trunk upstairs. My mother's handwriting appeared again, scrawled in desperate margins, half-finished notes as though she hadn't had time to complete them. And then I saw something worse. Photographs. Black and white images, aged but unmistakable. My mother, younger, standing beside men and women I barely recognized. Their faces were tense, their postures stiff, as though forced into place. On the back of one photo was a single word: covenant. A chill ran through me. My breath came shallow, ragged. What was this? A secret society. A family oath. The more I stared, the less sense it made. Yet the word pulsed in my head, echoing like a warning. Before I could gather my thoughts, a sound reached me. Soft, deliberate footsteps on the stair above. I spun, lantern shaking in my hand. The trapdoor was still open, but the light from above had dimmed, blocked by a figure standing at the top. My uncle. His voice floated down, calm but edged with something sharp. "You shouldn't be here." I swallowed hard. The morning after my confrontation in the hidden chamber, I woke with the taste of fear still sharp on my tongue. My uncle had said little after finding me there. He'd only stood at the bottom of the stairs staring at me with a gaze that pinned me like an insect before quietly ushering me out and locking the trapdoor behind us. No explanation, no denial, just silence. And somehow that silence screamed louder than any confession. I tried to go about the day as though nothing had happened, but the house refused to let me forget. Every hallway felt narrower, every door heavier. The walls groaned with whispers that pressed into my ears like secrets begging to be heard. I found myself tracing my fingers along the wallpaper, half expecting it to breathe beneath my touch. At breakfast, my uncle sat at the head of the table, as calm as ever. He buttered his toast, sipped his tea, and asked about my sleep as though we hadn't shared a moment of unspoken menace just hours before. His civility was a mask, and the longer I watched him, the more I realized it had cracks. A twitch in his jaw. a pause too long between questions, a flicker of tension whenever I shifted in my seat. I wanted to demand answers, to throw the journal onto the table and force him to explain, but something in me held back. The way he watched me, like a chess player studying the board, waiting for me to make a move, I knew speaking too soon could be dangerous. Instead, I returned to the journal, poring over its pages late into the night. My mother's words circled endlessly. The covenant binds us. The whispers guard the secret. Trust no one. The more I read, the less it felt like metaphor. Each line was a warning, a desperate attempt to leave me clues. On the fourth night, I woke to a sound that rattled me to the bone. A voice, low and broken, humming from the hallway outside my bedroom. I froze, clutching the blankets tight around me, straining to listen. The hum grew louder, drifting closer, until it stopped just beyond my door. My pulse thundered in my ears. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. And then, silence. When I finally gathered the courage to open the door, the hall was empty, but a faint scratch marked the wood just above the handle, fresh and jagged, as though someone had traced a symbol into it with a blade. My stomach dropped when I recognized it. It was the same mark I had seen carved into the old oak tree in the woods. I staggered back, nearly dropping the lantern I carried. Whoever, or whatever, had stood outside my room that night was tied to the same darkness my mother had tried to warn me about. And now, it knew. I was searching. The following evening, I overheard my uncle speaking in hushed tones near the study. His words were muffled, but one phrase carried through the thick door. "She's getting too close." My breath caught. Who was he speaking to? The house had been empty except for us, or so I thought. The sound of footsteps leaving the study told me otherwise. Someone else was here. I waited until the silence stretched long, then crept into the study. Papers were spread across the desk. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a heavy silence that felt even more unsettling than the howling winds. The streets glistened under faint pools of light, and every shadow seemed stretched into something menacing. Detective Harris moved cautiously, his footsteps echoing against the wet pavement, the quiet almost taunting him with secrets yet to be revealed. He knew someone was out there, watching, hiding behind the darkness. Inside the safe house, Emily sat rigid in her chair, her eyes locked on the flickering light bulb above. She hadn't spoken much since the last encounter, her mind still tangled with fear and unanswered questions. Harris entered, his expression grim but steady, and she finally asked the question that had been eating at her. Why me? Why am I being pulled into this? His silence said more than words ever could. The detective poured himself a cup of bitter coffee, the steam rising like smoke from an unseen fire. "Because you saw something that wasn't meant to be seen," he finally replied. His voice carried the weight of certainty, but there was hesitation too, as if he wasn't sure how much truth Emily could handle. She wanted to push for more, but the sharp knock on the door froze both of them in place. Harris raised his hand for silence. Each second felt stretched, heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. Another knock came, slower this time, deliberate. Emily's heart thudded so loudly she was afraid whoever stood outside would hear it. Harris moved closer to the door, his hand brushing the holster at his side. He opened it just a fraction, and in that narrow gap of darkness, a folded note slipped through. The paper was damp from the rain, the ink smudged but still legible. Harris unfolded it with steady hands. Though Emily could see the flicker of unease in his eyes, the words were scrawled in a jagged hand. "Truth dies with silence. Speak, and the dark will swallow you whole." The room seemed to shrink around them, the message pressing down like a curse. Emily whispered, "They know where we are." Her voice cracked, her body trembling as though the floor beneath her might give way at any second. The morning brought no comfort. A pale light filtered through the curtains of the safe house, but it only revealed how little rest either of them had found. Emily's eyes were rimmed red, her body heavy with exhaustion, while Harris looked like he hadn't blinked all night. The silence between them wasn't a born of peace. It was a silence thick with unspoken fears and doubts. The detective finally broke it. We can't stay here any longer. Whoever left that note knows where we are. If we wait, they'll corner us, and the dark will swallow us whole." His words echoed the message, and Emily felt the chill of them settle in her chest. She nodded, though every part of her longed to stay hidden, away from the game she never wanted to play. They packed quickly. Harris was deliberate, checking his gun, gathering the few documents and files he had pieced together during the investigation. Emily moved slower, her hands trembling as she folded clothes into a small bag, as though each piece of fabric was a tie to the life she feared she might never see again. When they stepped out into the damp morning air, the street looked deceptively calm. A milk truck rattled in the distance, a dog barked behind a gate, but both of them knew that normalcy was only a mask. Somewhere, eyes were watching. Somewhere, silence was waiting to claim them. Harris led Emily toward the car parked 2 blocks away, their footsteps careful, their heads turning at every small sound. She tried to keep her breathing steady, but paranoia clung to her, whispering that each shadow hid something terrible. When Harris opened the car door, she froze. A folded scrap of paper lay on the driver's seat. He grabbed it quickly, scanning the jagged words. This time the note was shorter, almost mocking in its simplicity. "You can't outrun silence." Emily felt her knees weaken. She wanted to scream, to demand how they always knew where they were, but the weight in Harris's expression told her there was no answer she wanted to hear. They drove in tense quiet, the rain beginning again in thin streaks across the windshield. Every car behind them felt too close, every pedestrian a potential threat. Emily clutched the strap of her bag, her knuckles white, as Harris's eyes flicked constantly to the mirrors. "They're not just watching," he said quietly, almost to himself. "They're hurting us." She didn't ask where, because she feared he was right. Instead, she whispered, "So what do we do?" His response was sharp, determined. "We stop waiting for the silence to come to us. We hunt it down." Their destination was a crumbling library on the edge of town, a place Harris claimed was tied to the names and events he had been piecing together. To Emily, it looked like nothing more than a skeleton of forgotten stories, its windows cracked, its doors sagging. Yet as they stepped inside, she realized that forgotten places often kept the loudest secrets. Dust filled the air, and the faint smell of mildew clung to the worn shelves. Harris moved with purpose, scanning the aisles, checking behind the counter. Emily followed reluctantly, her nerves jangling with every echo of their footsteps. "Why here?" she asked. His eyes darted to her, then to the far corner of the room. "Because silence always leaves traces, if you know where to look." They reached a hidden stairwell, narrow and steep, leading down to a basement. The air grew colder with each step, the light weaker. Emily's breath fogged in front of her as they descended, the sound of dripping water accompanying their every move. At the bottom, a door waited, rusted, scarred, but locked from the outside, as though something within had been kept away. Harris broke the lock with a swift kick, and the door groaned open. Inside, the small chamber was lined with boxes, files stacked high, and in the center, a chair with restraints bolted to the floor. Emily's stomach turned as she realized what this place had been. Harris approached one of the boxes, pulling out faded photographs and notes, each piece pointing to the same pattern. Silence wasn't random, it was orchestrated. Among the files was one with Emily's name scrawled across it. She recoiled, her heart hammering, but Harris flipped it open, scanning the contents. There were photos of her, dated weeks before she ever met him. Images of her walking home, sitting in cafes, even sleeping in her own bed. Emily gasped, her hand covering her mouth. "They've been watching me for months." Harris's expression hardened, his voice low and grim. "This isn't just about what you saw. It's about you. You were chosen long before you realized it." Emily staggered back, her mind reeling, the walls of the chamber pressing in around her. The silence here wasn't absence. It was alive, a predator that had marked her long before she ever heard its whispers. Harris closed the file, his jaw set. "This ends now. We've been on the run long enough. If they want silence, we'll force them to break it." As they climbed back up the stairs, Emily knew there was no turning back. Whatever truths lay buried in the dark, they were tied to her, bound by secrets she hadn't even known existed. And with every step into the daylight, she felt the weight of a question she was too afraid to ask. Could truth survive, or would silence consume them both? The drive away from the library felt heavier than the descent into its basement. Emily sat in the passenger seat, staring at the file Harris had let her hold. Every page was a violation of her life, her habits recorded, her roots mapped, her solitude invaded. Each photograph confirmed the truth. She had been living under the gaze of someone who considered her nothing more than a piece in their game. Harris drove in silence, his focus sharp, but his knuckles gripped the wheel tighter than usual. Emily could sense his mind racing, the weight of decisions pressing hard on him. She finally broke the stillness. Why me? Of all people, why would they choose me? Her voice cracked, equal parts anger and desperation. Harris didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, watching a dark sedan that seemed to trail them. Because you were easy to watch, because you didn't notice the shadows, and because silence needs victims who don't scream. His words chilled her. She turned to look at the sedan, but it slowed at the next light and vanished down a side street. Emily shuddered, though part of her wondered if it had been real at all or just another trick of her growing paranoia. They stopped at a small roadside diner, its neon sign flickering weakly. Harris insisted they needed a place to think, somewhere public enough to buy them a sliver of safety. Inside, the smell of burnt coffee and fried food clung to the air. A few truckers sat hunched over their meals, their conversations low and forgettable. They slid into a booth at the back, the file between them like a forbidden text. Harris pulled a notebook from his coat pocket and began scribbling connections, names, dates, locations. Emily stared at him, her nerves taut. You act like this is just another case, but it's not. It's me. My life is written in those pages. Harris paused, meeting her gaze. I know, and that's exactly why we can't let silence win. Whoever's behind this, they've built a network of fear. People disappear, truths get buried, and those who dare to ask questions end up in files just like yours. This isn't about one victim. It's about control. Emily lowered her voice, though anger seeped through her tone. So what do we do? Just keep running until they catch us? He leaned forward, his eyes hard. No, we draw them out. The plan sounded reckless, even as he explained it. They would use Emily as bait, knowing the silence had already marked her. Harris would stage a meeting, feed false information, and wait for the ones in the shadows to reveal themselves. Emily hated every part of it, but deep down, she knew there was no safer choice. If they didn't confront the silence, it would consume them at its own pace. The diner door creaked open. A man in a long coat entered, his steps slow, deliberate. He didn't glance their way, but Emily's heart raced. She felt the prickling certainty of being watched, studied. Harris placed a steady hand over hers under the table, his grip both protective and commanding. Stay calm, he whispered. The man ordered coffee and sat at the counter, his back to them. Still, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that every movement of hers was being tracked. She forced herself to breathe evenly, to keep from bolting, but the thought of being prey in someone else's hunt gnawed at her composure. When the man finally left, Harris stood abruptly. Time's up. They know we're moving, and that means we're running out of chances. Back on the road, the storm returned. Rain battered the windshield in relentless sheets, the wipers struggling to keep pace. The world outside blurred into streaks of gray, as though reality itself was dissolving. Emily clutched the file tighter, as though holding the evidence kept her anchored. Suddenly, headlights flared behind them, bright, invasive, and far too close. A car tailed them, refusing to back off. Harris's jaw clenched. Hold on! He pressed the accelerator, the engine roaring as the chase began. Emily's pulse hammered in her ears, her body thrown against the seat as Harris swerved down narrow lanes and deserted roads. The pursuing car didn't falter. It matched every turn, every surge of speed. Emily's breath came in gasps, her fear spiraling into panic. They're going to kill us, she whispered. But Harris's focus was absolute. Not tonight. He veered sharply onto a back road leading into dense woods, the tires skidding on wet asphalt. Branches scraped the sides of the car as they plunged deeper into the darkness. Behind them, the headlights swayed, closing in. Emily could almost feel the silence creeping nearer, ready to swallow them whole. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the lights vanished. The road behind them was empty, the storm muffling everything but the frantic beating of their hearts. Harris slowed, his breath ragged. Emily stared into the black void where their pursuer had been, unable to decide if they had escaped, or if the silence was only waiting for the next strike. When they finally stopped, Harris turned off the engine. The car sat in the middle of the woods, rain pounding the roof, the darkness pressing in from all sides. He looked at Emily, his voice low, resolute. "This isn't random anymore. They're pushing us where they want us to go, which means we're closer to the truth than we think." Emily's hands trembled as she whispered, "And what if the truth is worse than the silence?" Harris didn't answer. His silence was an answer in itself. The storm had eased, but the woods were far from quiet. Every dripping branch and whisper of wind carried a menace of its own. Emily sat stiff in the passenger seat, drenched in fear more than rain. Harris checked his revolver, the old metal glinting faintly in the dim light of the dashboard. "We can't stay here," he muttered. "They've already chosen the ground. If we sit still, we're theirs." Emily wanted to protest, but she knew he was right. The silence wasn't retreating. It was gathering, tightening like a noose. They got out of the car, their feet sinking into the muddy earth. The forest loomed, every tree a potential hiding place. Emily clutched the file to her chest, the papers within now heavy as lead. As they moved deeper into the woods, faint lights glimmered ahead. A clearing opened, revealing a decrepit farmhouse, its windows black, its roof sagging like an old scar. Harris froze. This wasn't chance. This is where they wanted us. Emily's breath caught. What if it's a trap? It is, Harris replied, his tone grim. But traps work both ways. They approached cautiously, every step an invitation to danger. The door creaked open before they touched it, as though expecting them. Inside, the air was stale, thick with mildew and rot. Yet on the table in the center of the room lay something disturbingly deliberate. A lantern glowing faintly, illuminating more files, more photographs. Emily's face stared back from every page. She staggered forward, her eyes darting over the images, her at work, at home, asleep in her bed. Notes scrawled in tight, cold handwriting documented her movements with precision. "This is insane," she whispered. How long have they been watching me?" A voice answered from the shadows. "Long enough." A figure stepped into the weak light, tall and calm, his expression unreadable. It was the man from the diner. Emily recoiled, her heart slamming against her ribs. Harris aimed his revolver, but the man raised his hands with eerie composure. "If you shoot, you'll never know the truth." Harris didn't lower the weapon. "Start talking." The man's lips curled in something between a smirk and a sigh. "You think this is about one victim, one woman marked and followed?" "No. This is bigger. Silence isn't just an organization, it's survival. We document, we control, we erase. The world is built on secrets, and we make sure those secrets never break free." Emily's voice shook as she asked, "Why me?" The man's gaze settled on her with unsettling calm. "Because you noticed. Because you heard the whispers when others didn't. You could see the cracks in the silence. And for that, you became a liability." The weight of his words pressed down on her. She hadn't asked for this, hadn't wanted to be part of anyone's war. Yet here she was, standing in the center of it, her life reduced to a case file. Harris took a step forward. "If you think we're going to let this continue, you're wrong. Every secret leaves a trail, and this one ends tonight." Before the man could respond, a second presence shifted in the shadows. Another figure emerged, then another. The farmhouse was no meeting place. It was a hive. Emily's breath hitched as the truth landed like a blow. They weren't facing one man. They were facing the silence itself, embodied in countless watchers who had stepped out of the dark. The lantern flickered as the circle closed in. Harris pulled Emily behind him, his revolver steady but hopelessly outnumbered. "Stay close," he whispered. The first man's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You can't fight the silence. You can't kill what doesn't exist." But Emily, trembling, found her own voice. "Silence only wins if no one speaks." Her words seemed small in the vast hush, yet they carried weight. Harris seized the moment. With his free hand, he grabbed the lantern and hurled it across the room. It shattered, flames licking hungrily at the old wood. Panic fractured the calm. The shadows scattered as fire surged, consuming the silence's sanctuary. "Move!" Harris dragged Emily toward the door. The farmhouse roared behind them, the watchers' cries swallowed by the blaze. The storm had left the woods slick, but they ran, tripping, stumbling, hearts racing as the fire painted the sky with orange fury. They didn't stop until the glow was distant, swallowed by the night. Collapsing against a tree, Emily clutched Harris's arm, gasping for air. "Did we end it?" she asked, her voice ragged. Harris shook his head, his face grim against the firelit horizon. "We ended something. But the silence, it doesn't burn that easily." Emily looked back toward the dying glow, a mixture of dread and defiance in her eyes. "Then we keep speaking. We keep fighting. Because if we don't, the silence wins." Harris met her gaze, the faintest glimmer of respect in his weary expression. "Then we speak louder." The night closed around them once more, heavy with secrets and unfinished battles. But for the first time, Emily felt the silence had been wounded, forced into retreat. And as long as her voice remained, it would never fully claim her. The whispers had not ended, but neither had her will to defy them.